Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Ron Laurie, who's a specialist in human development and value systems. On this program, as you'll be aware, our first program deals with the spiritual background for a person to establish the basis from which they operate, and then a series of following programs will explore how that relates to life and where they bring value into community. Thanks for coming, Ron.
You're welcome.
Now, as I just said, let's have a look at your spiritual background, right from the day you were born. What were you born as?
What was I born as? I was born as a boy.
Yes, good.
And christened as Ron Laurie.
As Ron Laurie, yes.
Into the lovely land of Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back a few years.
Mm.
Yeah.
And the faith structure that you were born into?
Well, yeah, predominantly Church of Scotland as a faith structure. It was the kind of predominant way in which most of our family and our relatives were brought up in a Church of Scotland environment. Mm. Yeah.
And that's a Protestant church, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And was your family very religious? Was it a sort of a fairly strong?
Not overtly. There was. I do recall at times when my mother and father did go along to church, but that kind of fell away from my perspective and my observations over a period of time. So it wasn't overtly religious, the kind of environment that I grew up in.
Well, what was Scotland like in those days from a spiritual perspective? Was it a strongly Christian value systems, or?
It was very segregated because where I grew up, and Scotland has got this reputation of Catholicism and Protestants. And that's fairly set in the culture because you go to a Protestant school or you go to a Catholic school.
Okay.
You support where I came from, which was Glasgow. You support Rangers, which was Protestants, or Celtic, which was Catholics. So right from the beginning, there was always a divisional sort of emphasis of who were you? Were you a Proddy or were you a Catholic? And that was the kind of environment that you grew up with. And I was a Protestant and born into a Protestant and Christian environment.
So in that context, which causes you to reflect on actually who you are, what did being a Protestant really mean?
Well, being a Protestant, what that really meant was that I was, I wouldn't say corralled, but I was expected to be part of the Boys' Brigade, which was the kind of Church of Scotland's youth group. And I couldn't have gone to anything else but the Boys' Brigade. Some friends I had in the neighbourhood who were Catholics could go to Scouts, but that wasn't for Protestants. Protestants had to go to the Boys' Brigade. And I had a strong family tradition of which there were a number of Boys' Brigade leaders in the family.
That's an interesting division there. And so that this is in behaviour. What about the spiritual side of it? How strongly was that reinforced?
Well, there was always, of course, Boys' Brigade happened on a Friday night and you were expected to go to Bible study on Bible class on a Sunday morning. Okay. And so that was the religious and the scripture exposure that I had as a youth. But it never penetrated. It never penetrated. It was an aside to what was really most important as a youth, and that was just hanging around with your mates and having a good time.
Yes.
And so latterly, when one looks back, one can pick up on some of the things that were taught there, and it did have an impact. Christianity did have an impact later on in my life, but not at that part of my early life in Scotland. No.
So you were, say, 15, 16. Did you go to a religious school?
No, it was just a normal school. General school. It was a Protestant-orientated school,
right?
And that was.
So, where did your spirituality start to manifest itself? What age were you? What place were you when that happened?
Well, it's an interesting question, because some of my early recollections of what I would call now as a sort of mystical experience happened on the way to school. It never happened in the Boys' Brigade. It never happened in school, but happened on the way to school.
Really?
Yeah. And it came about because I guess I was a kind of introspective kind of kid. But I always remember walking to school and repeating to myself consistently. And it was kind of like a self-referential, where I was saying, this is me. This is who I am. This is who I am right now. This is me walking down this street right now, here and now. I am here right now, walking down this street. And I was trying to reference and find out exactly what it was that I was by asking myself those questions. And on occasion, I used to experience quite a profound sense of, I'm not sure if it was elatedness, but it was a kind of profound sense of being acutely aware of a life force that was within me. And it used to quite startle me, and it scared me a little bit. I thought, there was a little bit of a Fruit Loop.
Yes, around breakfast time, that could be right. Being a Fruit Loop, there's also a time essence here, and what you're describing when we talk later about integral theory, that's the seeds were obviously sown for you there. We'll take a break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Ron Laurie, who's a specialist in human potential and the development of value systems. And talking about value systems, when we went to the break, you were speaking about this experience you had as a child, which was quite revealing. It was an internal focus. This is who I am. I am here. How did that manifest itself later? Was that the roots of something which developed within you?
Absolutely. It became a constant way of inquiry for me. I was always trying to reconcile exactly what those experiences were. And, I didn't find it in institutions like the Boys' Brigade or the church. But they gave me little inklings to other people who had those kind of experiences. But mine was a kind of like a spontaneous, without any guidance kind of experience, which I would describe now as a little bit of a state change, which I went through while I was going through those sorts of self-inquiry questions.
Did it ever, have you gone down a more spiritual, religion-based process? Have you followed that path at all?
Absolutely, yes, I have. If I think about if I just take on that sort of experience with the Boys' Brigade, for instance, what that mainly involved was hanging around with your mates, and it was quite a violent environment. It was the kind of place where abuse did happen, and it was anything but a Christian kind of institution.
Yes.
From my experience as a boy in that environment. And so that was a little bit of a mystery to me. What was being said and what was being preached was certainly not what was being manifest in the institution. So I kind of had an experience of when I was with those instances with other boys, where we used to go away to Boys Brigade camp once a year. That's the only reason why we went to Boys Brigade, was so we could go away to Boys Brigade camp, which in a sense turned into quite, drink, theft, violence with the local boys where we went to camp. So it was anything but. And that had a lot of guilt associated with it at one point in my life. And one of the profound experiences I had when I had an opportunity to shed that guilt, and I went along to the Usher Hall in Edinburgh to a evangelical gathering, and it was called Let God Speak. And I was given the opportunity to go forward and to give to Jesus all those things which I had guilt of. And I had a really profound change experience. It was kind of like a weight off my back with that guilt, which was, in a sense, a spiritual experience for me. But it didn't stop there.
It didn't. No. But once again, there's a small seed there of something that we'll talk about a bit this program or later, about managing change, because that sounds to me like managing change. And where did it roll on to from there? As you said, that wasn't the last of those experiences.
Well, all through my youth, I had experiences where I used to wander. I was quite fortunate that where I lived, I could wander off into the hills and into the moors and find myself on top of mountains and hills where I could just lie back on top of the heather and lay myself out prostrate and look up and just wonder about life and about existence. And in those instances, then I had, a feeling of oneness. Which is often, talked about in religious sort of context. But those experiences weren't in a religious environment. They were always outside of the religious environment, the most profound ones.
So that allowing for the difference, using the different term between religion and spirituality, that they were spiritual experiences. You recognised them as spiritual experiences.
They were. Yes. And in my trying to reconcile those spiritual experiences, I did try to do that within a religious context and within religious institutions, but it never quite felt right, or it never quite worked out for me. So I moved on from those institutions once experienced them. So
your experience with the evangelical church, did you stay with that for long?
I stayed with it for quite a while, actually. I was responsible when I first came to Australia in 1982. Myself and my wife were responsible for planting 2 or 3 different churches in the Melbourne area.
Oh, really?
And I was a youth leader, and I was maybe a lay pastor, or I never went through the ministerial credentialed route, but I was allowed to lead communion. I was allowed to lead some services, and that was, in a sense, a satisfying period of time for me. But I guess I have always been curious, and so I kept on asking questions.
Yes.
And asking questions. And sometimes the questions I asked got me into trouble. And sometimes the questions I asked were actually upsetting to some others. But I couldn't let go of that experience, which I wanted to firmly understand as me and my experience. And within the religious context, it didn't quite work out.
Just interesting that you were allowed to give communion. Communion, of course, doesn't have the same intensity as, say, the Eucharist with the Catholic faith. But did you connect with any spiritual awareness at the point of doing a communion?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the, again, throughout my life, there's been these spiritual experiences. And, you know, in some of those evangelical environments, when the singing and the music was so uplifting,
Yes.
with such a profound sense of spirituality in those, which used to remind me of the spiritual experiences I had prior to that. It was the same thing. It was the same phenomenological experience, which was part of me, which had the same themes.
And the key part of phenomenology is, in fact, time, and we've run out of it. So we'll go to a break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And we're speaking with Ron Laurie, who's a specialist in human potential and the development of value systems. Ron, we've traced a fascinating spiritual essence through your life to this point. Now you're in Australia, you've come from Scotland, you've set up, was it 3 or 4 of these churches? You're actually involved in doing a level of preaching, you're actually involved in doing communion, and there's a sort of a spiritual component in that. What happened out of there?
In parallel to going through the church, I was an avid reader, and I was always, as I said, trying to reconcile spiritual experiences or insights that I had, and where did they come from, trying to understand them for myself. I was interested in things of an esoteric nature as a result of that, and I came across a body of knowledge which was called transpersonal psychology, which talked about states of awareness that people have, which were not necessarily in a religious sort of context, and that deeply interested me, because here was a little bit of a study into what was being described as human potentials,
Yes.
other than what might be seen ordinarily in everyday life. And so that took me down a track of inquiry into that area. And it's quite interesting, because the more I inquired about and bringing that sort of questioning into the organisation, the Christian organisation was that, the more alienated they made me feel. And the more alienated it made me feel, the more I realised that what is often said is not actually exhibited in behaviour. And so I ended up, my wife and I, after putting a lot of time and effort into a lot of church, at a time of our lives when we had 2 children to look after, we decided to leave organised religion. And it was almost like walking out of one door and having it slammed behind you.
Yes.
And never to be spoken to again. So it was a lot of alienation happened.
Absolutely.
As a result of that, which confirmed a lot of things for me. And it kind of confirmed that I was perhaps on the right track, that there's more to this spirituality than what actually happens in a religious context. And so that made me more curious about those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oftentimes doors closing behind you do lead you into a greater level of awareness. But this transpersonal psychology, who were the authors behind that?
Well, there's a number of authors behind that. There's people such as Stanislav Grof, Ken Wilber, a number of theorists around about that point in time.
Yeah.
My entry into it came through interest in the Institute of Noetic Science, which was an institution put together by Edgar Mitchell, who was a former astronaut,
Yes.
who had what he would be described as the overview effect, having a look at the world from the cockpit of a spacecraft and seeing it as a little globe in the midst of nothingness.
Contextualized it.
Totally. And he had a profound shift, which he would describe as a sense of a spiritual insight at that point in time. So there's people like that, which I began to find all over the world in my research. This is about the time when the internet began to come online. And it was a tremendous research tool to use to realize I wasn't an oddball. I was quite normal to a certain extent about having these experiences and to actually look for their meaning outside of a religious context.
I'll ask you a question which you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but in all of this, is there a God concept? Is there a divine being, a divine essence concept, which is carried forward from your religious experiences in the church into this new transpersonal awareness?
I used to have a concept, or what I would refer to as an objectification, external to myself, of a being of some sort, and I could relate to that. But in a sense, you know, that I feel as if that was a sort of phase I was going through. My reference to it is more of an internal reference rather than an external reference. So when I understand myself about my spirituality, it doesn't need an external objectification outside of myself. It's an inside experience, and my experience, and my unique experience, which is more real to me than any external icon or any external concept of God or religion.
And that sort of tends to play into sort of Ken Wilber and others' concept of the unity of the one, the wholeness, so that
absolutely.
it is one level of awareness, not separate ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you think there's any chance of a bridge between the transpersonal awareness, just to use that as the term? It's expanded beyond that, I know, but building a bridge to the theistic, church-structured spiritual perspective. Have you seen any potential for a bridge?
Look, I'm not sure if it's a bridge I would describe it as. I see, and my experience has been, a lot of people within religious institutions who have dared to go beyond the dogma or the doctrine and to explore for themselves what it is for themselves and ask themselves some quality questions. I see it more as a transition, as a transformation, which doesn't negate what has gone before, but it transcends and includes it. I'm still very much along the lines of appreciating where I've come from in my spiritual path and journey.
On the issue of transcendence, time has transcended our interview, but you're coming back next week, as I understand.
I think so.
That's terrific. Fantastic. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity, and next week we'll be returning with Ron to speak about transpersonal issues in greater detail.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.